on the face of it, you might not want a light industrial zone in your community because you're worried about reverse sensitivity or about, you know, big ugly buildings. But then when you actually went and looked at the rules for the light industrial zone, you might see there are controls about emittance of dust and noise, that there are controls about the interface with a residential boundary. And when you look at all of that, you might then end up with a different conclusion about, am I concerned about this light industrial zone in my community? So it is important that you understand, as we take you through the provisions for each of the zones, they're just as important as the spatial application of the maps. And as John will talk to you, just to complicate things, we have overlays, which obviously have a different impact. But planning is very much about the integration. It's not about a piece, just one rule or one provision. And that's why even when you look at the residential provisions, just focusing on density actually won't give you the picture of what is allowed or what is prevented in a zone, because it's a very minor part of the whole outcome. So hopefully as we take you through, we can be explaining that to you. But I do, you know, these sessions are really designed to help you understand that. And if we're talking planning gobbledygook or jargon, you need to say I don't get what you're talking about. But as John says, by taking you through this, we hope that as we bring the recommendations to you, you're not having to wonder what's the difference between a controlled activity or... So if the panel recommends something that we had said was discretionary is now restricted, you get a sense of what that impact is and can go back to these notes to refer to it. So hopefully you will hold on to this stuff as a bit of a reference piece.
Look, thanks for that, Chair. I think, I mean, for myself, we're all going to have to interrogate the words of this document that comes through, because I've been thinking one could look at a map and look at a boundary between, I don't know, commercial and residential, whatever category of residential it might be, and we might think that's good or bad. But unless you look at maybe what the panel came through with in terms of where do they land with the design criteria, where do they land with height in relation to boundary rules, all of that, the difference between that, you know, the alignment of boundary, or where that boundary is between commercial and residential, might be quite significant if the rules delivered are considerably weakened over what we last proposed. I mean, I'd be very worried if the design criteria that we've worked really hard on were eroded considerably. And we might, if we just fixated with looking at the graphic, at the map, and not digesting that part and the rules, we could get ourselves in a situation where the outcomes are quite perverse.
Yeah. No, that's sage advice, Councillor Darby. I think it's very easy to just look at the one or two things that people have been very loud about and have far more monumental decisions flow past unnoticed. So that's a good point. Mark?
On the same theme, I get the educative purpose of this exercise, but just to clarify, really, if to use the example with a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week event kind of permission, the issue is not going to be the activity status. It's more likely to be the wider rules that the hearings panels come back with, and so it would be that broader context that we'll be looking at the decisions from the hearings panel, and rather than specifically on the activity status or specifically on the notification aspect.
Yeah, I think it's the more strategic. What is our strategic response to that, rather than necessarily diving down into the detail?
Yeah. But just remembering it's good to make sure everyone remembers what these things are, because we've had discussions over the last few weeks which lead some of us to be a little bit concerned that perhaps it isn't that well understood. Okay, back to you, John.
Right. So the other key part of the RMA is notification, and so regional district plans can specify whether an activity is always notified, never notified, or assessed on its merit, case by case, under Section 5 of the RMA. So Section 95. Section 95, it requires an assessment of the effects on the environment, an assessment of the effects on affected parties, or any impacts on affected parties, and it also talks about any special circumstances that might exist that would warrant notification, even if the effects on the environment were minor and that there were no affected parties. So that's the standard Section 95. So those are the three key options that you have when preparing a plan. You can specify always notified, never notified, or the normal tests under the Act. Regional and district plans cannot specify limited notification. So this came up quite a bit during the drafting of the entry plan. Can we actually say, well, this will be okay, but we really need to notify immediate neighbours, or we really need to notify Historic Places Trust, or we really need to notify some resident group? We cannot do that. That is not an option. You've only got those three options up there. It's all, nothing, or a case-by-case assessment under Section 95. So I suspect that might come up again when we get the recommendations. You won't see any recommendations from the panel specifying limited notification to particular groups or neighbours.
So can I just ask, but does that mean though when you're doing the section, when there's an assessment under Section 95, you could come up with limited notification in that, but you have to go through the process?
Yes, we're saying that the plan can't, your plan, when you're preparing your plan, can't specify. But when a resource consent is applied for, and that's what we're talking about now with this table, when you do this assessment under Section 95, you'll either come up with an outcome that's non-notified, and that's where it would be processed without public notification, no limited notification to affected parties, and the consent can be granted or declined depending on the type of consent, its activity status, and only the applicant can appeal decision in that case of non-notified. But then under Section 95, you might result in limited notification, and that's where you've done an assessment of the effects on the environment as a whole, and you've concluded that they're no more than minor, so you've passed that test, which starts to lead you down to non-notification. But then you assess in terms of affected parties, and you might reach a conclusion that there are directly affected parties, and that would result in limited notification just to those parties. It's not full public, and only those parties can make a submission. They can attend the hearing and they can appeal the council decision.
No, I'm clear about that. It was just sort of unclear in that bigger one whether that was still an option, but it is an option.
It's an option at the resource consent stage, not at the plan
thrown
development stage.
out of Section 95.
Yeah.
Good.
And then the last one is when it's fully notified, and that's where the effects have been identified as more than minor, or your plan has specified that this is something that will always be notified. Anyone can make a submission, attend the hearing, and anyone can appeal to the Environment Court limitations on things like trade competition. So those are the three possibilities there when you actually do the assessment under Section 95.
There is under Section 95 the aforementioned special circumstances. It's like a catch-all which has survived all the RMA reform since 1991. It gives the council that option.
Yeah, and so there's been case law on what special circumstances are, and probably the most recent case is the Ports of Auckland case.
What, sorry, didn't hear that.
The Ports of Auckland case is what clarifies or gives some clarity as to what a special circumstance might be. Prior to that, we were relying on a case from a few years back, which had a different outcome. So the courts are kind of establishing through case law what a special circumstance is, and they've lowered the bar essentially with ports.
Okay.
All right. Just last one in terms of how we've used notification in the entry plan. So we've used all three of those options. Some activities we've specified will always be notified. Some we've specified will never be notified, and the majority in the entry plan just default to the normal tests under Section 95, where you're looking at something case by case on its merit as to whether or not it should be notified. Any questions on notification?
That's good.
Good. Designations. So they're a little bit different. What are they? They're a planning tool. They were provided for under the previous Act before the RMA. They essentially override your district plan provisions, which tends to be your zoning provisions. unless something is done on the land that's not in accordance with that designation, in which case it defaults to the district plan. A key thing is they can't override regional plan provisions, and again, those regional plan provisions deal with the coast for the regional coastal plan, and also air quality, water quality. Those will be the key areas where a designation can't override those. They tend to generally lapse 5 years after they come into effect, unless the designation specifies a different date. Who can use designations? Only specific listed entities in the RMA, in a schedule to the RMA, but it's essentially your infrastructure providers, social and physical infrastructure, public works agencies. They're referred to as requiring authorities in the Act. They use them to legally protect works or future works, and it's organisations like Transpower, New Zealand Transport Agency, Auckland Transport, Watercare, Ministry of Education for Schools, can have these special powers under the RMA to essentially override the council's district plan provisions. They can apply to all or part of a property. They can restrict what the owner of that property can do on the land without getting the requiring authority's permission. They can assist in facilitating land acquisition under the Public Works Act. So if something's confirmed as a designation through the designation process, then it gives an ability to acquire that land if needed through the Public Works Act and compensation and so on. So that's essentially it for designations.
Councillor Quacks?
I suspect that some of us have, or all of us at some stage, have run into some difficulty around that designation where a designation has been put in place for a long period of time. It hasn't been utilised. People have come into the area and then they realise that that land is then going to be used for the purpose for which it was designated. And so it's, I don't have a question around that, but it's something that can be problematic at times. I know that on the Manukau City Council, we had a piece of land that was designated as an area for education, but it had been used for almost 5 years as a park for the local community, and the local community understood that it would remain a local park. So then it caused a huge problem once it was the school took up, or the education department took up the option of making that into a school. So yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. Thank you.
Right, so moving on to the final part of the presentation this morning, and this is just a bit of a recap on how we developed the PORP and also some of its key contents at a very sort of high level. So quiz time again, very quickly. Question is, how many legacy planning documents do we have in Auckland?
31.
Wrong.
8.
Good try.
Wrong. More than 8, less than 31. So this is from the former district councils and the ARC.
Oh, it's 13.
13? Yeah. Correct. Yep.
Well done.
Can I get a bigger bar than that?
Mine is much more relevant legally. Who cares how many there are? A lot. And they're so high.
I counted 31 and that I'd like to put in a protest.
Oh, did you get... I wondered how you came up with such an unequivocal answer,
Well, doesn't he get a
Councillor
lie just
Watson.
for counting? I thought that was pretty impressive.
For innovation, Councillor Watson, I think a special reward for
exactly.
you.
I
I
like
thought
that,
that
man.
was pretty
I
damn
got a
good.
rugby ball at the nines just for asking
Yep.
questions.
Excellent.
No,
Absolutely,
well done.
mate.
Okay.
Energy over and above beyond the call of duty. Well done, John.